Fantastic today to have Melanie Weber visiting us. Melanie is a new faculty in the Applied Math department at Harvard University. So Melanie did her, what does that say? It's in German. I can't read it. I think I'm supposed to plus, okay, thank you. So I met Melanie many years ago when she was actually sort of concurrently finishing her undergraduate degree at Leipzig University and was doing her master's in applied math right over here in Lewis Hall. And so I had the great fortune of working with Melanie, myself, along with Pedro Maya. And we actually wrote a paper back then. And so it was such a fantastic experience to have worked with Melanie all the way back then when she was just growing up into what she is today. And then after the time she was here, she actually went to Princeton, did her PhD there. We have a lot of Princeton alum in the audience here. She worked with Charlie Pfefferman, and then went on to Oxford for a year before returning back stateside to Boston. And so she's going to tell us a lot about geometry and machine learning. So this is exciting for all of us because many of us are thinking about embeddings of data quite a bit for dynamics. And so I think we have a lot to learn here from Melanie. Such a pleasure to have you here, Melanie. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation and for having me. It's fantastic to be back at UW and great to meet so many of you over the last 2 days. Okay. So let me get started. So as you see at from the title of the talk, we were talking about geometric structure and optimization and machine learning. And a lot of this work is, before we get started, a question to the people on Zoom. Does that all look good, or do you have windows popping up with like people? It looks good. Okay, great.
Your questions on Zoom, I can raise them for you, or we can unmute people. We can wait to the end of the talk.
I think there are some natural stopping points in the talk, so maybe I'll stop there and then we can take some questions. Okay, great. Okay, yeah. So this line of work is motivated by the observation that we find geometric structure in many machine learning and data science applications. And here on the slide, you see a couple of examples, some of which we will get back to throughout the talk. So one type of data structure that we often encounter in machine learning is relational data, so maybe graphs or networks. Here on the slide, you see a knowledge graph that you might encounter in natural language processing and a protein-protein interaction network that computational biologists are interested in. And one type of geometry that we can often find in such data sets and exploit for downstream tasks are hierarchies or tree-like structures. And we will see examples of that later on. If you're working in computer graphics, you might have encountered 3D shapes, surface meshes that are indicative of a spherical geometry. So it would be another type of geometry that we often encounter. Back to computational biology, there's recently been a lot of interest in exploiting symmetries in protein folding, in structure prediction for molecules. So you might have heard of AlphaFold by DeepMind, which has very successfully incorporated symmetries in the data into their deep learning architectures. We will see some symmetries in this talk, although of a different kind. The kinds of examples that we will see are motivated by matrix valued problems, where we can exploit low dimensional structure and also symmetries. So in general, in the context of observing geometric structure in data, there are two research themes that we can consider. The first one relates to data geometry. So how can we recognize and characterize geometric structure in data? How can we learn representations that represent such structure? So again, this can be symmetries, this can be curved spaces, curved geometries. Generally, the workflow looks like you see here in that picture. So we are presented with a data set, we are in data space, we perform some analysis to characterize the geometry of our data, and then we want to find good representations. Sometimes it might be beneficial to stay in a discrete space, so to work directly with a network or a graph, or sometimes we may want to learn an embedding into a continuous space, which can be a Euclidean space or a manifold. So that relates to maybe reconstructing a manifold from data that aligns well with the geometry of the data. So that's all under the umbrella of understanding data geometry. And then once we have a characterization of geometry, we have learned a good representation. We want to make use of those representations in downstream tasks. So we are interested in performing machine learning and optimization tasks, either on graphs or on manifolds that represent our data well. In this talk, we will see some work in both directions. So we will start with thinking about data geometry through the lens of curvature, and think about how that can be applied in representation learning. And then most of the talk will be spent on looking at downstream tasks. So here we see various examples of geometric structure that we find in data, and then look at very specific machine learning tasks that we want to perform. So we look at tree-like data, where our sample task is classification. We look at graphs, where our sample task is clustering. And then we look at manifolds, and here, as I already said initially, we will mostly focus on matrix valued tasks. Okay, but let me start with data geometry. So as I said, we are interested in learning good representations. So on a high level, what does it mean to have a good representation? A good representation preserves similarity relations in our data. So if we have two data points that are very similar, then they should also be represented by points that are in a metric sense close by. Our representation should preserve symmetries that we have identified in our data. And most importantly, our representations should be useful for downstream tasks. So we will see several examples throughout the talk where having low dimensional representations is beneficial. So sometimes a data can be well represented in multiple spaces, but maybe in one of the spaces, the representation is particularly low dimensional. So that would be, in that case, a beneficial representation that's useful for downstream tasks. In general, we usually get good representations if the geometry of our data aligns well with the geometry of our space. And in order to motivate this, I want to show a toy example. So of course, in actual applications, the examples are going to be much more complex, but this is a toy example that illustrates this idea of aligning data geometry and the geometry of the representation space on a simple example. So the example here is the Mercator projection that goes back to the Middle Ages, to the Flemish geographer Mercator, who devised a map to represent the geography of the Earth in the two-dimensional world map that we all know and everybody has used before. So that's a map that takes the surface of a two-sphere and maps it to the two-dimensional Euclidean plane. Now, what happens with that map is illustrated in this animation. So here we start with the world map as we know it, and then we rescale the land masses to their actual sizes. And now notice that close to the equator, the length scales are pretty well preserved. But as we move away from the equator, the land masses appear overly large. Right, so this map introduces a representation error. This is well illustrated if we look at two examples. So let's say we pick Mexico, which is right at the equator, and Greenland, which is very far from the equator. Then we see that although Greenland appears to be much, much larger in our world map, it is actually not that different in size from Mexico. So this nicely illustrates the representation error that we have here. And now just imagine, for the sake of this toy example, if we were to learn a machine learning model on this misrepresentation that somehow works with the length scales of the land masses, then that would introduce a very significant error that can be extremely difficult to correct down the line. Right, and this misrepresentation here is a consequence of the fact that it's just impossible to represent the surface of the two-sphere in the two-dimensional Euclidean plane. So here we have a misalignment of the data space and the representation space, and that causes issues that we can only very difficult correct down the line. So we have to be very careful and align the geometry of our data space with the space in which we represent our data. So how can we understand data geometry and pick a good representation space? My favorite tool for analyzing data geometry is curvature. Even if you're not haven't taken a course in differential geometry, you probably have some intuitive understanding of what curvature is. You might know that Euclidean spaces are flat. The sphere is positively curved. And then I'm sure at some point you have encountered these like saddle-like structures, which are examples of negative curvatures. Now, our data is usually given this in a discrete format. So maybe it's a point cloud, or maybe as a graph or a network. And in discrete spaces, if we want to measure curvature, we have to use discrete notions of curvature. This is in general a very rich formalism and has been applied in many, many domains. I'm listing here a few that I'm aware of. We will see some applications to representation learning and also biomedical applications in the talk. Okay, so curvature in the differential geometry sense, if you know a few things about geometry, you know that already. Curvature is a tensor. It's defined with respect to the differential structure of that manifold. Now, of course, in discrete spaces, we don't have a differential structure, so it might be at first unintuitive to define a curvature notion. For the purpose of this talk, the only thing that you have to know is that discrete curvatures are usually defined with respect to analogies. So we know that curvature has certain properties, certain relationships with other mathematical tools in continuous spaces. And those relationships have analogies in the discrete space that we want to preserve and utilize in downstream tasks. So we want to define a discrete curvature notion that preserves these analogies. And that's usually how these discrete notions of curvature come about. I want to just briefly show, you don't have to remember this in detail, the two notions that we will see in the talk. So there's Olivier's notion of, I should say the curvature notions that we are using are all discrete variants of Ricci curvature. On manifolds, Ricci curvature measures geodesic dispersion, so it has relations to volume growth. In the discrete setting, there are two important notions that are usually considered. The first one is Olivier's Ricci curvature, which is defined with respect to analogies of optimal transport. So how optimal transport relates to curvature in manifolds, and then a similar analogy we can build in graphs. There are also interesting relations to the graph Laplacian that are preserved in the discrete setting. And then there's Foreman's Ricci curvature, which again is defined with respect to an analogy between Ricci curvature and the graph Laplacian that we don't have to go into. What's important to remember is that due to this notion via optimal transport, Olivier's curvature can be quite expensive to compute on large-scale graphs, whereas Foreman's Ricci curvature is a nice combinatorial equation which can be very easy computed even in large-scale settings. And there are very strong theoretical and also empirical connections between the two notions. So that's all you have to remember related to curvature for this talk. Yeah, so let's go back to this question of picking a good representation space for our data. Here we're looking at a simplified version of this problem. So we assume that our data is given as a graph, as a network, and we drastically reduce the possible choices of representation spaces to constant curvature spaces. So in addition to Euclidean spaces, we look at hyperbolic spaces, which are spaces of constant negative curvature, and spherical spaces, which are spaces of constant positive curvature. Now, if we look into the graph theory literature, there's already some work on what types of graphs might be represented well in each of these three so-called model spaces. So we know that the lattice embeds very well into Euclidean space, trees embed very well into hyperbolic spaces, and these cycles are called n-rings, embed very well into spherical space. So now, unfortunately, in practice, our networks look more like this simple example here of the karate club. So this is not just going to be a tree or a cycle, but we will have substructures that are cycles and substructures that are trees. So in other words, our real-world data is usually very heterogeneous, so we can't directly apply these classical techniques. Nevertheless, we can use curvature to characterize the geometry of our data. So as I already mentioned, those curvature notions have a relation to volume growth, and volume growth is also the mathematical reason why those homogeneous structures like lattices or trees embed well into their respective spaces. So lattices have, in the discrete sense, polynomial growth of the neighborhood sizes, and Euclidean spaces have polynomial volume growth. Trees have an exponential neighborhood growth, and hyperbolic spaces have an exponential volume growth. And this alignment is in principle the reason why they are so suitable for representing such data structures. So if we can get a good characterization of volume growth or neighborhood growth in our discrete data set, we can aggregate that information across the graph and find a good means for choosing among the three spaces which one is the most suitable. And in this work, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but in this work, we have also looked into how we can efficiently evaluate those neighborhood growth rates so that it's scalable for the types of large-scale networks that we typically encounter in practice. And this has strong connections to various notions of graph curvature, so the discrete curvatures that we looked at, also Krumov's delta hyperbolicity that some of you might have heard, which is classically used to detect hyperbolicity or measure tree-likeness in graphs. Okay, so with this brief excursion on data geometry, we want to spend most of the talk now on looking on downstream tasks, and we will start with tree-like data. So we've just talked about this embeddability problem. Again, we have already said that trees embed well into hyperbolic space due to exponential volume growth. So maybe on this slide, I just want to briefly illustrate what exponential volume growth means. So if we are in a tree and we look at a very simple binary tree, let's say we start at the root node and then we go down level by level to see how the neighborhood of the tree of the root node grows, then we see that that grows as 2 to the k as we step down level by level, and that's of course an exponential growth. Hyperbolic space is a little bit more difficult to illustrate the exponential volume growth here. I'd like to look at this artwork by MC Escher. This illustrates a hyperbolic or one parameterization of hyperbolic space, and each of those beds that you see in the pattern has the same area when measured with respect to the geodesic distance in that space, so the hyperbolic distance function. And you see here that close to the center, we can place 3 beds in a circle. And then as we increase the radius of that circle, the number of beds that we can place, and remember all of them have, if we measure it with respect to the hyperbolic distance, the same area, we see that the number of beds that we can place also grows as 2 to the k, again illustrating this exponential volume growth. Okay, so and what that does is that we can represent data that looks tree-like in a low-dimensional hyperbolic setting. So in a sense, this exponential volume growth allows us to accommodate an exponentially growing structure in a low-dimensional setting, whereas if we would choose Euclidean embedding, which only grows polynomially in the dimension, we would have to increase the dimension very quickly as the size of our tree grows. And that's sort of, illustratively speaking, the reason why tree-like data can be very well represented in hyperbolic spaces. And now on the first slide, we have seen some examples, and I'm sure you can think of many other examples where we find hierarchies in data science or machine learning applications. So hierarchical data is everywhere, and that makes hyperbolic spaces for machine learning very attractive as representation spaces. Okay, so now looking at the our example here, the classification task. So now imagine that we have taken a data set that is hierarchical and we have represented it in hyperbolic space. And now we want to perform a classification task on it. So if we were in a Euclidean space, there are many nice algorithms for performing classification. Probably the simplest is the perceptron. I'm sure all of you have seen that at some point. So as a reminder, we have blue and red dots, right, which correspond to 2 different classes, and we want to learn a separating hyperplane to allow us to classify, to label those points. And the optimal, in black here, you see the optimal hyperplane, and then the green hyperplanes are iterations of that algorithm, which is written here in short. So now if we are in the curved space, for instance, on a hyperbolic manifold, so if you're a geometer, you know that this is the Lorentz model of hyperbolic space. So one of many different parameterizations of hyperbolic space. So let's say we have computed an embedding, and now our data points lie on this manifold. And since we're in a curved space, we can't use those classical algorithms, right? They don't take into account our curved geometry. So we have to translate our algorithm to this setting, and that's what we did here. So basically, we have to adapt the update where we have to ensure that our update stays valid, intersects the manifold. So what this algorithm learns here are Euclidean hyperplanes as shown in red that intersect with the manifold, and those intersections kind of take the role of those green and black lines in the Euclidean setting. So now with the perceptron algorithm, of course, we can learn some separating hyperplane, but not necessarily the one that is most optimal in the setting. So what we typically do is that we extend this to a large margin setting. So margin defines the distance between the like how well separated 2 points from opposite classes are. Similar notion to that we can define in the manifold setting. And then here specifically in the setting, we looked at robust large margin learning. So where we want to be robust against noise, or maybe if we have new data coming in that's slightly different from the data that we've seen at training time, we want to be robust to this. So what we are optimizing is not only for a large margin, but also some robustness to perturbations and noise. Okay, maybe I don't go into the details of this algorithm. So these settings of robust learning, you're probably very familiar with in the Euclidean setting. Maybe I just point out the difficulty in the curved space. So here we use an adversarial training approach. So we, in addition to the training data that we have available, we augment that data set with the few additional points that we create by perturbing points in our training data set. And now, of course, if we're in a curved space, we have to be very careful that we do those perturbations on the manifold. So we can't just add like a little arrow to it. We have to move those points on the manifold. And that at first seemed to us as a very difficult task, but in fact, that can be fairly easily done. So adversarial training is certainly viable also in curved spaces. The more interesting part that I want to get to with this part of the talk is to look at representation trade-offs. So you might ask, we can also so those hyperbolic spaces, right, that we've seen are low dimensional manifolds that lie in a higher dimensional ambient Euclidean space, and many other settings. Maybe we don't have a hyperbolic manifold, but some low dimensional manifold structure. Can we say something whether it's actually beneficial to perform the task directly on the manifold as opposed to working in that ambient Euclidean space, right? So you could argue that we go through all this trouble, design a new algorithm, have to deal with all the difficulties that come with the curved setting. Is it actually beneficial, provably beneficial to work directly on the manifold as opposed to the ambient space? And in this setting here, we can show that that is actually the case. So if we, in both theory and in practice, so for the theory, if we analyze the complexity of our algorithm, so the second line here is the complexity of our algorithm, and then there's a very similar robust large margin learning algorithm in the Euclidean space that people have analyzed before us. And we see here that the complexity of those algorithms scales exponentially in the dimension of the space that we're working in, right? So the more dimensions we have, then it becomes exponentially more costly to, or you need exponentially more iterations in order to achieve a certain accuracy. And now if we go back to our motivation of representing hierarchical data in hyperbolic space, then we can look at, let's say we have an actual tree, then we can look at how many dimensions do we need to represent that structure accurately in hyperbolic space versus Euclidean space. And that's what you see here in this informal theorem statement. So in fact, if we have actually a tree, so no triangles or anything in it, an actual tree, then we only need 2 dimensions in hyperbolic space to faithfully represent that structure because of the exponential volume growth. Now in Euclidean space, we have only polynomial volume growth. So the number of dimensions that we need grows logarithmically in the size of the tree. So it's much, much higher than in the hyperbolic space. And now if we compare that with our complexity guarantees, we see that in order to have a comparable performance, we need a much, much higher dimension in Euclidean space. And that translates in a much, much more costly algorithm. And this is here just stated informally, but we can properly prove that by sort of looking at a trade-off between representation error or distortion and those margin guarantees that we that you would prove in order to analyze the convergence of such algorithms. And we can also see this in practice. So this is just a small validation experiment. So here we're looking at image data, so a subset of ImageNet that we have selected to fulfill the theoretical properties in our theorem. So to directly validate the setting where we have a theoretical result. So for this data, we have some ground truth labels that we just use to pre-select the data. So this should be hierarchical, and we should have two subtrees, meaning that this data should be we should be able to learn a binary classifier that is able to label the data into the two subtrees. And then we took that data set and we embedded it into Euclidean and hyperbolic space of different dimensions. And then we used just a simple perceptron algorithm to see whether it can recover a classifier that is able to perfectly label the data set. So if we have a perfect representation that doesn't introduce any error and perfectly preserves the structure of the data set, we should see a perfect score. And then if it's not a perfect score, that means that the perceptron algorithm does not achieve a zero test error, and that is coming from some representation error in our embedding. And you see here that in Euclidean space, we have a very bad performance. Even as we increase the dimensions slowly, it doesn't improve very much. Whereas in hyperbolic space, maybe not in 2-dimension, which was the theoretical prediction, but in 8-dimension, we get a perfect zero test error, meaning that 8-dimensional hyperbolic space is able to faithfully represent the data set, and the linear separability that we have in the labels. But as in Euclidean space, we still have a significant test error, which shows up as this bad performance in the experiment. Okay. Maybe I stop here for questions before going on to the next downstream task. Yeah.
In this ImageNet set, how big is this tree? How many branches and whatever?
Yeah, so that's the 1 point. Yeah, so in total 3,000 data. It's a small validation experiment. Yeah.
Cool. And they represent different kinds of classes of animals.
Yeah, two subclasses. I can't. So maybe carnivores and canine or something like that. I can't tell you what exactly was used, but something like that. Yeah.
On a linear space, you have the result tolerance of your same way matrix.
Yeah.
What is the exact rule of the result tolerance? What is this like little star?
Yeah, that's the Minkowski product. Yeah, that's the inner product structure in the hyperbolic space. So I glossed over that a little bit, but as I said, like we can't take the Euclidean algorithm, right? We can just translate the algorithmic idea of the perceptron algorithm and then write down what would be the equivalent in the hyperbolic setting. And that's also what you will later on see when we look at the optimization algorithms. It's the same. Like we want to have an algorithm that kind of does the same in the manifold setting. So we have to translate or generalize the algorithmic idea of the Euclidean algorithm and make it work in the manifold setting. So things like the inner product structure has to be adapted. We have to work with the geodesic distances instead of the Euclidean distances and so forth.
Is that like the basically like distances in special relativity? Like the interval and space-time? I mean, special.
Oh yeah. So the Lorentz model that might have looked familiar. Yeah. So the 4-dimensional Lorentz model is typically what's used in general relativity. Yeah.
And you have your like signature of the metric.
Exactly. Yeah.
There's so much rule structure. What is the metric signature, or is it a?
Also, the metric signature, yeah, so that depends on the metric signature determines the curvature of your space, right? So what you were describing leads to a negatively curved manifold, and then if you're on a positively curved manifold, you have a different signature, and if you're on a flat space, you have a different signature. Yeah, so basically, if you compare it determines your inner product structure. So the Minkowski product is aligned with the signature of hyperbolic space, and then in Euclidean space you have a different inner product which is aligned with the signature of Euclidean space. Yeah. Sure.
So in Minkowski space you can have points with negative distance.
because of the minus sign, but this happens here too.
With negative.
Sorry, when in Gauss space, because of the negative sign that appears in the inner product, you can have negative distances.
So I know nothing about general relativity, so I might not be familiar with this, but the geodesic distances that we're using here are like proper metrics. So they fulfill all the, the axioms of a metric, so you wouldn't have a negative distance. But I don't know what happens in general relativity. Sorry, yeah. Okay, was there anything in the chat? No, right?
No.
Okay. Then let me continue. So now we're switching gears completely. The next example of geometric structure and downstream test that we want to look at is learning on graphs. So now our data is not tree-like, but is generally a graph. And the test that we want to perform is clustering. So again, we've seen some examples, and you probably can think of many applications where you encounter relational data in all kinds of areas of machine learning. So that's a very important class of geometric structure that we find. There are lots of like classical machine learning tests that you might want to perform on relational data. So things like node label prediction, link prediction, graph coarsening, and clustering. So lots of recent literature has looked at these tasks with graph neural networks. Here we don't want to use graph neural networks. We want to use curvature-based geometric methods. And we will specifically look at coarsening and clustering on graphs, which are closely related, as you will see. The motivation for using those curvatures, those discrete curvatures that we've seen earlier, comes from the following observation. Again, I stated quite on a high level. You can work it out in much more detail theoretically. So many real-world networks, many networks that we encounter in practice have this kind of community structure. So there are different sub-graphs that are, of which the nodes are very densely interconnected, and then you have only a few connections across these communities, right? And this is sort of this structure is the basis for all kinds of clustering and coarsening algorithms. So if you want to coarsen a graph to maybe reduce the size to make it more manageable for some downstream analysis, you want to maybe collapse some nodes within the community into a super node, and maybe want to collapse some of these edges across into a super edge, such that the high-level structure of the graph is preserved, but you have reduced the complexity a little bit. If you do community detection or clustering, you want to basically learn, without having labels. You want to assign community labels to each of the node to recover those subgraphs. Yeah. And where the relation to curvature comes in, if we compute either of those two curvature notions that we saw earlier on a graph, then we see that those edges that go across communities have a much lower curvature than edges that are within a community. Okay, and based on that observation, we can use that to build algorithms for graph coarsening and clustering. The basis of those algorithms are a Ricci flow. So basically, we want to use that curvature information and iteratively evolve the weights that we have on the edges of our network according to some dynamic equation. So that again has like an equivalent in differential geometry in continuous spaces is very well studied here. And that would be again just a discrete analog, which we can derive similarly to those curvature analogies that we've seen earlier. And then this is just the basic equation, how we would evolve edge weights according to curvature. D here is usually just chosen as the path distance. So if you have two nodes in your network, then you look at how many edges do I have to cross to go from one node to the next. If I choose the shortest path, and that defines a distance metric on our graph. And then curvature here can be either Olivier's or Foreman's notion of Ricci curvature. And what this evolution of the edge weights does is that it basically exaggerates that effect that edges across communities have a lower curvature than within communities. So we see here in an example that the weight, if it's evolved under Ritchie flow, the weights get smaller for edges that are within communities, and become larger for edges that are across communities. Okay, so this effect is basically exaggerated and reveals the structure in a more pronounced way. So for coarsening, we can then use this structure that's revealed under the Ritchie flow to identify this coarse structure. So as I said earlier, we might want to collapse or merge certain nodes into a supernode and certain edges that grow across communities into a super edge. So we want to reduce a large-scale network to a smaller structure. One toy example that I want to show here, where we have done this curvature computation to reveal the core structure, is shown here in this toy example. So those are characters in a well-known French novel. So each of those dots is one character in the novel, and then I just have annotated here the main players in the book. And each time a character meets in the book, we draw an edge between them, and then the edge is weighted according to how often they meet. So each has a weight associated that is scaled according to how frequently they interact in the book. And then the lines that the edges that are colored here in red are what we get if we perform this algorithm and identify sort of the core structure of the network. And then if we draw that out, I don't know who of you has read the novel, but you see that exactly corresponds to the two communities, to the two main storylines in the book, around one centered around Valjean, which is the main character, and then a second one that talks about the French Revolution. And then we also identify the bridge between the two communities where the storylines sort of merge, which is here shown with the dotted line. So this is just a toy example. This right-hand side you could have easily drawn by just reading the book. But of course, we want to apply that for some more large-scale data. What you see here is from a collaboration with neuroscientists at the Max Planck Institute in Tübingen, and they work with fMRI data and then build very large-scale networks of neural activity out of this fMRI data that we have here analyzed with curvature. And here our goal was to identify functional subnetworks to see if we can identify functional subnetworks in this very large-scale data. And we did find two subnetworks here. One is related to, so this is just on the left-hand side, you see the curvature distribution. And then on the right-hand side, you see where in the brain the activity is that corresponds to the subnetwork that we identified. And the first subnetwork that we identify was corresponded to the kind of brain activity that you see for an emotion task, which was exactly the task that was performed by the patients in the scanner. And then the second test network that we identified is called the default mode network, which is sort of a baseline activity that you always see if you put somebody in a scanner and don't let them do anything specific. So kind of the background or the baseline activity that you always see. So that was really interesting that we could identify those two networks in a very noisy, large-scale data set, which can otherwise be difficult with other methods. Just to give a second example where we looked at identifying those subnetworks, those core structures, we looked at some metabolic networks. There we found a coarse structure that corresponds to hydrogen reactions, which is, again, from the chemical context, exactly what we would expect. So similar to seeing the subnetworks corresponding to the task that the patients performed. Again, here we were sort of validated by what we would expect from the domain knowledge. And then similarly, we looked at co-expression networks. And here you find as core structure housekeeping genes, which are genes that are involved in that are central to many chemical pathways. And again, that would be exactly what you would find, what you would expect to find in data in terms of ground truth. Okay, So the if we now move on to clustering, so this was mostly for graph coarsening, identifying subnetworks. If we actually want to use that now to do community detection. So what we could do once we have identified the communities and what are the bridges, and we know that those will have low curvature or very high weight. If we evolve it under Ritchie flow, we could just cut those. So we use a partition-based method to identify our communities, our subnetworks, and then assign labels accordingly. And there have been many algorithms, curvature-based algorithms proposed that use this. So our method used this Foreman-Ritchie curvature because it's much easier to compute and much more scalable. And there's also some work that uses Olivier's curvature and tries to look at this from a more theoretical perspective. Those algorithms are usually not so scalable if you look at these very large data sets like the neuroscience data that we looked at. So those partition-based approaches now assume that we actually have those bridges going across communities, but in many settings in practice, those communities are actually overlapping. So we might not be able to identify those bridges just because they don't exist. Some node is a member of many communities, not only of one, so there are no unique node labels that we can assign. So the question is, can we use curvature-based methods in that setting as well? And we have some recent work where we propose such an approach. So this is very recent work, just should be coming online in the following days. So what we do here is that we rewrite the graph into its line graph. So the line graph means that each edge in our graph becomes a node in the line graph. And then if we have neighboring edges, so let's say those two edges that join a vertex, then those are connected in the line graph. So it's just a different way of writing the structural information that's given in the graph. And now if we have a setting like this, where one node is a member of the red and the blue community, then we don't have a bridge in the original graph. But if we rewrite the network into its line graph, then we do have a bridge. So if we use our curvature-based method in the line graph setting, we can identify the bridges, we can cut that, and then recover the node labels from that, and still use our curvature approach, even though we have overlapping communities. And we have also done some preliminary experiments with that. So that's for a citation network, and then social network. FB is, of course, stands for Facebook. And then we compare that here with some other state-of-the-art, not deep learning-based methods, such as the Louvain method or spectral methods. And we see that our algorithm performs our algorithm based on these curvature ideas performs very competitively. Okay. So before moving on to manifolds, any questions on that? Yeah.
So the Ricci flow and the manifold, can you give a high-level overview about what it is?
Well, yeah, it's probably difficult. It's a quite abstract concept, so difficult to illustrate. But yeah, if you have a flow, if you have some dynamics evolving on your manifold, then that's of course influenced by how curved your space is, right? So if you're in a Euclidean space, it's flat, but if you're on a manifold and it's curved, you're evolving along geodesics, right? So the equivalent of what the shortest, like a straight line as in Euclidean space, is a geodesic. So you have 2 points on your manifold, and you look at what is the shortest path along the manifold connecting them. So those are geodesics. So if you would evolve something on your manifold, it would evolve along those geodesics. And then the shape of those geodesics is controlled by the curvature of your manifold. So this is where the Ricci curvature would come in. Yeah, so that would need to be integrated in seeing how your dynamics evolve. And this is where so Ricci curvature is I should have maybe said that. So there are different ways of measuring curvature on manifolds, and Ricci curvature is a sort of local curvature. So, as you construct your geodesic, as you locally evolve on the manifold, you want to see how curved is sort of my most immediate environment, and that's measured by the Ricci curvature.
the Ricci flow is sort of accentuating the curvature, so
in the discrete setting, yeah.
Can you go back a few slides, please? There's more. Yeah, I think this is one. So edges between communities and low probability and edges between communities and high probability. So from what I got from the curvature in this setting, the bigger the neighborhood gets, the lower the probability, right? Because it's closer to a exponential in a hyperbolic space. When I have a neighborhood of a point, it has a very big area.
So, I'm not sure. I'm sorry, I don't know. Yeah.
So in a hyperbolic setting, as you increase the neighborhood of a point, the area of the neighborhood increases exponentially. Okay.
Oh, so yeah. So I think what you're trying to ask is, so if I have like a, let's say like a star-shaped node, right? A node that's very heavily interconnected. Yeah. So those, if you look at where you would find those in real-world networks, so typically each community has like a hub. So those are called these like heavily connected nodes, one or two hubs. And typically those bridges that you have between the communities, those would be connecting hubs, right? So this is where the negative curvature comes in. So yeah.
So by so the negative curvature would happen at the node that the edge that's connecting the two communities, right?
Yeah, so those edges, right, that are shown here in red have a lower curvature than some of the black ones within the communities.
Okay.
Yeah, so and typically, so this is just a toy example. So here you don't really see this, but let's say, so those two nodes are connected by a bridge, right? One in the blue community and one in the red community. And typically what you find in practice is that those two nodes are very highly connected. So they have the star structure, which fits with your intuition.
Oh, okay. So,
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
where,
not really in my cartoon here, but if you look at actual things, yeah.
Like the points inside the community would have more connections, then they should have negative curvature, but we're saying that the hub is generally bigger.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
Can you just talk a little bit more about the relationship? So I imagine, I'm not super familiar with differential geometry, but I'm imagining like the connectivity of each node is like somewhat proportional to like the curvature in this manifold, and then the relationship of this just curvature on graphs to like how you're computing like the metric that you want for like computing distances between different groupings.
No, so in the graph setting, the curvature doesn't enter the metric. So in the graph setting, you always use the shortest path distance that I briefly described. Yeah, but on the manifold, you're right. How you measure distances on your manifold depends on the curvature of your manifold. Yeah. Okay, I think there's one in the chat.
We can read it out loud for people's benefit.
Oh.
In the overlapping communities case, it seems like in order to convert the graph to a line graph, you need to know the communities beforehand. Can you color the nodes in the line graph without knowing the community identity of the data?
No, that intuition is not right. So the line graph is just rewriting the geometric information that you have in the graph. So you know what are your edges become your nodes, and then you look at what are neighboring, right? So let's say this red edge is a new node that we want to, and then each of those blue edges that share a node with that edge are also nodes, and then those should be connected. So it doesn't take any extra information, and certainly no community labels. No. Yeah, so just given a graph, you can always compute the line graph without any additional side information. Okay, maybe in the interest of time, let me move on. We can do some more questions at the end. Okay, and now the final example that I want to talk about now actually looks at manifolds. So we've been, I guess, at least partially in discrete spaces so far. Now we want to look at manifolds. And here mostly we look at group symmetries that arise in matrix value tasks. So very generally, the setting is as follows. So most of the algorithms that you see apply to very general settings, so make very little assumptions on the manifold that we are working with. So we have some objective function defined on some Riemannian manifold, which has to be smooth and connected. And we want to find its minimum. And in this talk, or in my work, I'm particularly interested in settings where we have additional constraints, meaning that that minimum should lie on a certain region of the manifold that's defined by our constraints. And as I said, this is a very general class of problems that appears in many settings. So maybe in the hyperbolic spaces that we saw earlier, a lot of the matrix manifolds that we will see are also negatively curved. Negatively curved manifolds are known as Hadamard manifolds. Also, if in case you're interested in sampling, there's a very interesting recent line of work that uses Riemannian optimization in sampling. So many sampling algorithms, such as Langevin algorithm, can be viewed as optimization in Wasserstein space, which is the space of probability distributions. So that also has a quasi-Riemannian structure. So if we want to get convergence guarantees or any kind of theoretical properties of these sampling algorithms, we can analyze those as optimizations in Wasserstein space, where again, those methods come in. But for the purpose of this talk, we have some additional technical assumptions for the theorems. For this talk, we want to look at matrix manifolds, which we encounter in machine learning, mostly in the form of matrix valued subroutines in algorithms. So things like barycenter problems, k-means clustering, robust subspace recovery, generalized eigenvalues. All of those can be written as a matrix valued optimization task, and are in principle good use cases for using Riemannian methods on manifolds. And the two types of problems that we want to look at in this talk are constraint optimization. So again, we have additional constraints that require that our minimum lies in a specific region of the manifold. And then also we might have objective functions that are a difference of convex functions, and that's another structure that we can exploit. So historically, actually, these matrix manifolds, even apart from that they're appearing in many machine learning settings, those matrix manifolds are also in many cases the original use case that motivated the development of Riemannian optimization methods due to the following observation. So if you have a class of matrices that you're optimizing over, the perhaps natural thing to do is to use a Euclidean method. And then the class of matrices that you're working over enters as a constraint, right? If you're working with orthogonal matrices, you have an orthogonality constraint. If you're working with positive definite matrices, you have a positive definiteness constraint. So you can always use constrained Euclidean optimization to solve such optimization tasks. And then it was realized that if we reformulate the problems, so we encode the matrix class constraint in our representation, we rephrase the problem on a manifold that corresponds to that class of matrices, then we actually remove the constraint in a sense, and by directly working on the manifold, we can do unconstrained optimization. And in many settings, unconstrained optimization is easier to do than constrained optimization, and that has motivated a lot of early work, mostly on variants of gradient descent on manifolds. So, however, if we look at some of these use cases in machine learning, we see that in a lot of cases, we have additional constraints that come in, maybe an inequality or equality constraint, something like a norm constraint, a determinant constraint. So oftentimes there are either additional constraints that are hard requirements, or maybe we have some additional knowledge on where the minimum might lie on the manifold and can impose that as a constraint. And in order to handle such constraints explicitly in our algorithm, we need tools for constrained Riemannian optimization. And before our work, that was essentially a neglected area. So the first thing that we will do in this part of the talk is to look at how we can extend tools from constrained optimization to Riemannian manifolds. Now, a fair question that I often get at this stage in the talk is, so if we now have to impose constraints anyways, why don't just work in the Euclidean setting, right? So if we have to do constrained optimization anyways, this sort of benefit that we get from rewriting it is kind of removed. So why worry about constraint optimization on manifolds? And here actually comes in this idea of exploiting geometric structure. This reformulation of the problem from a Euclidean space to the manifold actually not only removes the constraint, but sometimes also can give us direct algorithmic benefits, namely in the form of geodesic convexity. So it turns out that an important subset of these problems is Euclidean non-convex. So if you look at the objective function through a Euclidean lens, it is non-convex. And as I'm sure we all know, non-convex optimization is tricky. We don't have the guarantee of a unique global optimum and have to be very careful with the initialization usually. So non-convex optimization is tricky. And if we can find a way to reformulate the problem such that we can do convex optimization, that's always beneficial. And it turns out that for some of these non-convex problems, they actually fulfill some weak notion of convexity, which corresponds to the convexity on the matrix manifold that we want to represent the problem in. So if we are in the manifold setting, we can actually use convex optimization, and that's a huge algorithmic benefit. Okay, so this is just one slide to briefly recall geodesic convexity. So it's essentially the same that you would expect from convexity in the Euclidean setting, just now along geodesics instead of along straight lines. So it's just a generalization of this concept. And as I said, for optimization purposes, convexity again guarantees us that we have a local optimum. If we find a local optimum, it's the global optimum. So we can we have algorithms with global convergence guarantees.
Gamma is a geodesic, right?
Yeah, gamma is the geodesic here. Yeah. Okay, so for constraint optimization, so this is an illustration of how we might translate a Euclidean algorithm to Riemannian to a Riemannian manifold. So for constraint optimization, if you've worked with that in the past, you probably know that there are essentially two classes of algorithms that one might use for constraint optimization in Euclidean settings. Both of those classes of algorithms are very well studied for many decades. The first one is based on extensions of gradient descent to the constraint setting. So the idea is very simple as follows. If we are after k iterations at a point xk, and then we compute the gradient, we find a feasible descent direction, and we do a standard gradient descent update in the feasible region. This, of course, doesn't take into account any constraints that we have in the setting, which are in the cartoon represented by this blue area. So what might happen is that we step outside of the feasible region where our constraints are fulfilled. And then in order to have a valid next iterate, we have to project back into the feasible region. And then depending on the geometry of our constraint set, that projection might be expensive to compute, in which case it is better to use a projection-free method. Most of those are variants of Frank-Wolf methods. So here, again, in iteration k, we are at a point xk, we compute the gradient, and then we call a subroutine called the linear oracle, which is shown here. And what that linear oracle does, it evaluates a linearization of the objective function to find a point in the feasible descent direction that just fulfills the constraints. So in our example here, that's like right on the boundary. And then we linearly interpolate between xk and zk, and then step along that line with a certain step size. And if we assume that our constraint set is convex, then any point along that line will be in the feasible region. So we can never leave the feasible region, and we don't have to worry about computing projections. Okay, and this basic idea is very useful for the Riemannian setting, where computing those projections can be difficult in practice. So it's very useful to have this Frank-Wolf type methods, which can directly incorporate constraints into the problem. So our work generalizes this algorithm to Riemannian manifolds. You see here like the key parts of rewriting this algorithm. So we have to compute the Riemannian gradient instead of the Euclidean gradient. And we now have to work along geodesics, so perform a geodesic interpolation instead of a linear interpolation that we would do in Euclidean space. we can, so after writing down this algorithm, of course, to show that that's a meaningful analog of the Frank-Wolf algorithm in Euclidean space, we analyzed it theoretically to see what kinds of properties does it have. Does it have the same kinds of convergence guarantees that you get in Euclidean setting? And that's the case. So we see that it has a sublinear iteration complexity, which is classically what you would expect from a first order method, and also in line with the best known Euclidean guarantees for the Euclidean algorithm. One difficulty when translating this algorithm to the manifold setting is solving this subroutine, the linear oracle. In the Euclidean setting, that's a convex problem, so a fairly easy to solve subroutine. Here it is non-convex, so we have to think carefully about how to solve this subroutine. It turns out that in many cases, it's actually fairly doable. So either we use a numerical solver to find an approximate solution, and then as long as that's a fairly good approximation, we retain our nice global convergence guarantees. More interestingly, perhaps, are cases where we can solve that subroutine in closed form. One important example is this class of problems. So here we're working with positive definite matrices, and we have inequality or interval constraints. Some of the problems that we saw earlier as simple problems are of this structure, for instance, barycenter problems. So in this case, we have a closed form solution for the subroutine that is easy to compute and certainly easier than computing projections. And we also see this in practice. So if we now do like a validation experiment, so here we have a set of positive definite matrices, and we want to find its barycenter. Importantly, so that's one of the examples that I mentioned that is Euclidean non-convex but geodesically convex. So here really the Riemannian setting gives us a better structure and algorithmic benefit. And here in the experimental results, you see in blue the our Riemannian Frank-Wolf algorithm. The dotted lines are some variants of that which I didn't get a chance to discuss, which numerically speed it up some more by only approximating the gradient instead of computing the full Riemannian gradient. And then the other methods here are, or were at that time when we wrote the paper, state-of-the-art methods. And we see here that we are very competitive for that task with the Riemannian Frank-Wolf method. And the good performance here is very substantially based on having that nice closed form solution for solving that subroutine. Okay, so now I'm out of time. Should I continue with the last slides or move on to a discussion?
Just continue the next slide.
Okay, yeah, I'm almost done. So the last class of problems that I wanted to mention are Riemannian difference of convex functions, or in general matrix valued difference of convex functions. So here we have objective functions of the following form. So f and h are convex, but of course the difference of convex functions is not necessarily convex. So in many settings where matrix valued settings where such structures appear, we again have a Euclidean non-convex function, but oftentimes actually we have this weaker convexity on a corresponding manifold that we can exploit here. So among the problems that we saw on the initial slide, for instance, the ones listed here can be written as geodesically convex difference of convex functions. So this problem class, or the algorithms that we are proposing here, are actually not strictly speaking only Riemannian methods. What we're basically proposing to do is to use a Euclidean algorithm, but analyze it through a Riemannian lens to explain its good performance. And previously, such methods were only such problems were only analyzed either through a Euclidean lens or a Riemannian lens. But this is an example where really recognizing geometric structure can help us to understand existing algorithms that work well better. So a classic algorithm for solving this type of difference of convex functions are CCCP algorithms. So this stands for convex concave procedure. And the idea is very simple. So we basically make use of the fact that H is convex to get this inequality, which we plug into the objective function to get an upper bound. And then the key idea of the algorithm is to successively minimize the convex upper bound of the objective function instead of the non-convex objective function itself. And whenever this subroutine here, which defines the minimization of this upper bound, is easy to solve, that translates into a really fast state-of-the-art algorithm. And very popular, has been used in many settings. Now, unfortunately, there's this paper from maybe 10 years back that shows that with Euclidean methods, we cannot hope to explain the fast convergence that these algorithms have. We can only get asymptotic convergence guarantees due to the non-convexity of the objective. But now, by realizing that actually for a very important subset of this problem class, we do have the geodesic convexity, we can utilize that structure in the analysis and can, with Riemannian methods, show that the CCP algorithm for the geodesically convex difference of convex functions is expected to have sublinear iteration complexity, which is also what we see in practice. So we can basically explain why the algorithm works so well. And I want to conclude with just showing two numerical examples where we tried this out. So the first one is an algorithm for computing square roots of positive definite matrices. So here, this subroutine that minimizes the upper bound can be implemented as a simple fixed point iteration, so very simple algorithm. And you see here in the numerical examples in red, the CCCP algorithm, and in black, the Riemannian gradient descent. So Riemannian gradient descent is a first order method. And you see here that it outperforms Riemannian gradient descent, but from the way how the convergence curves look like, we would expect a sublinear iteration complexity, which with Euclidean methods you're not able to show, but due to this Riemannian lens, we are able to certify that we would indeed expect a sublinear iteration complexity. And just a second example, computing Prof-complete constants. So that's a fairly abstract problem, but it has very important consequences to many other problems in information theory, machine learning, and also theoretical computer science. And here, again, the subroutine that minimizes the upper bound in the CCCP procedure can be written as a fixed point iteration. And in this case, it leads to a very fast, in fact, linear algorithm that is difficult to explain otherwise theoretically, but that we can certify with this Riemannian lens on the CCCP procedure to, in fact, have these fast non-asymptotic guarantees. Okay, maybe I skipped that. To summarize, so we've seen lots of examples where we can exploit geometric structure in downstream machine learning tasks. We have started with like a brief first part of the talk on discrete curvatures as a tool for characterizing data geometry. And then we've seen essentially three different examples: classification of tree-like data, geometric clustering on graphs, and then at the very end, optimization on manifolds. Yeah, and with that, thank you. Sorry for going over time.
Thank you, Melanie. I was really curious about this connection that you do between these hyperbolic representations and graph representations. And I'm curious if you could even flip that and say, okay, is there a way to construct your graph that basically maybe you bake curvature or something like that into the cost function for creating different clusters and networks and that sort of thing, rather than, starting from a graph and computing curvature between different modules within the graph.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand the
Sorry,
question.
so in order to construct these different communities within your graph representation, right? And then after that, describing in terms of curvature.
So it's essentially like a labeling problem, right? So maybe that was not clear. So in order to identify the communities, what I essentially want to do is, let's say I have, as an example, a red, a blue, and a green community. And then I want to color all the nodes in the green community in green, and the red community in red, and in the blue community in blue. And I want to use curvature to tell me which one to color in which way. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
I think they decided that.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah.
Maybe we can ask about the hyperbolic embedding. So maybe two thoughts I'd like to get your opinion on is, first, if you took spatial temporal data like turbulence, it seems like a very nice way to think about embedding the sort of hierarchical structure that you see in turbulence from coarse scales to fine scales. Do you know of any work where people have tried to embed turbulence features in a hyperbolic embedding like this?
No, I'm not aware of this, but this could be, I think, very easily tried. So I didn't mention that here, but there are nice toolboxes just for computing the hyperbolic embedding, so that we used in the experiments, for instance. I can point those out. So if you have some data, you could just, see how well such an embedding can recover the structure. Yeah.
Great, we should try that.
Yeah.
Number two, it seems like it'd be very strongly, the hyperbolic embedding seems to be very strongly related to like fractal structure. Has anybody made a connection between those? Because it just seems like even, I mean, you showed it with Escher, right? It's like,
yeah.
Okay, so we know that.
That was a very similar. Yeah.
But it seems like there would be, even again with turbulence. Could you either structure it that way? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if anybody's done it, but it seems like that would be a very promising avenue of push.
Yeah, so certainly in the embedding methods that are out there, I don't think that's, or at least I'm not aware that that's been done. It's possible that there are sort of in the mathematical literature connections between hyperbolic spaces and different fractals. But yeah, I don't know that literature well enough to comment. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm still struggling to understand how, like, you can take the non-convex problems in the plane space and get some convex manifold. And so the way I'm understanding it is you have a Euclidean problem with some constraint, and the objective is non-convex. And should we be thinking of this as the constraints on the non-convex problem actually like break the degeneracy of these minima?
So
Now
the
there is a global minimum?
So the geodesic convexity has nothing to do with the constraints. That's separate. That's just a property of your function. So if you, I showed this only very briefly, but if you look at this definition of geodesic convexity, right? So if you look at it through a Euclidean lens, then your geodesic gamma here is of a specific shape. So you get a straight line. Right, and now if you're on a manifold, then depending on which manifold you're at, your gamma has a specific form that depends on the structure of that manifold, on its curvature, and so forth. So in a sense, you could think of geodesic convexity as being more general than Euclidean convexity. So if this condition holds with gamma being a Euclidean geodesic, a straight line, then you have Euclidean convexity. But what this condition says is, okay, maybe this condition doesn't hold in Euclidean space, but if I find the right space and the right gamma, I actually have this condition fulfilled. See what I'm saying? So you could think of, if you have a specific problem, you could think of, can I find a space where the geometry of that space allows me to have a gamma that fulfills this condition? Yeah, so it's completely distinct from the constraint setting. Yeah.
So, I have a question. So in this first class of your presentation, you spoke a lot about related data sets, so graphs, you have a connection between points. Would you do that? You try to apply these techniques maybe to points that don't have the structures, like if you have points that are in some higher order Euclidean space, you have scattered points. We will try maybe to find a way to represent them in another type of geometry. Or is that something that you haven't thought about yet?
Sorry, I'm not sure. So you're saying like the three spaces that I showed? You mean like the,
So, you used, the fact that you have connection between your points, edges between your nodes in a graph.
oh, that's actually a very weak assumption. That just means I have access to some similarity measure. So for my data set, I have some way of saying those 2 points are similar and those 2 points are dissimilar.
So if you had instead of these edges, you had like points in an Euclidean space, you could just use a distance.
That's exactly what you do. So if you have a point cloud and it lies in some high dimensional Euclidean space, you look at the pairwise distances, and then maybe each point becomes a node in your graph, and then you draw edges to the 5 closest points, let's say, and that gives you a similarity graph, which you can use as a as the starting point for your embedding algorithm. That's exactly what's done in practice. Yeah.
Right. I think we had to go to lunch still. So thank you guys all for coming. Thank you all for being on Zoom. We have our next one, first Friday of next month. Daniela Witten from UW is going to talk. So let's thank Melanie again. 4 o'clock, first Friday.